for that.
Do you need this?
Yep. Good afternoon. Thank you for staying. There's nothing worse than turning up to speak and the room is empty. It might be empty by the time I've finished, but that's a different story. So I have a slightly different view on life when people talk about startups. I actually think startups are not a thing. There's multiple parts of a startup. And as I've alluded to, I call them startups, grow-ups, and finish-ups. And I'll describe what that looks like in this presentation. So for my sins, because I'm a very old person, I used to have a previous life. I used to be an accountant. It sounds like an Alcoholics Anonymous type confession. And I'm in recovery and have spent effectively the last 15 years of my life working with early stage businesses, startups, particularly early stuff. But I spend more of my life now thinking about later stage businesses. I'm currently unemployed, trying to figure out what I do next. But historically, I ran a lot of accelerators. I previously ran Techstars in London, and have made about 100 seed investments in the last 5 years. So I've done a lot of early stage investment, but a lot of those are now less early and fortunately for me, slightly later stage. And so I'm seeing a lot of the problems which inherently I describe here. And sometimes I'm a dad as well. Okay, we can't be standing here and not talking about Star Wars. I've just read the reviews. It's amazing. Go and see it. The basic idea that I have in my head is actually a startup is very like a child from inception through to puberty, through to going to big school, followed by getting a real job. And to some degree, I think about the baby being the startup. It's kind of 0 to 1, 0 to 2 years old. And then they start to have to kind of grow up. And then at some point, having kind of gone through teenage angst and squeaky voices, they actually have to go and get a real job. And I think of those, they're technically the same thing, but actually what they do and how they do it actually are different and fundamentally change on the way through. And so one of the biggest challenges that amazing entrepreneurs, and you have to be pretty amazing to do this, is to see the whole journey through, to actually go from inception right through to finish up. And examples I like to give is if you look at Google, Sergey and Brin were absolutely amazing at starting a business. But what they actually did do was they brought in Eric Schmidt to help them do the grow up and the finish up. In the meantime, Larry learnt his trade and then eventually stepped back into the business as a CEO. But it's not often you'll see someone who goes from 0 right through to the end and be able to manage the changes on the way through. So everyone has been talking about startups. And the thing I find is there's a lot of work done and a lot of education and lots of very smart people been talking about how you do startups. And those that know, these are kind of 3 of the key elements. There are many, many more. And so the godfather of really startups is this man at the bottom here called Steve Blanks, who in 2003 wrote a book, and if you haven't read it, you should, called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. It's actually really hard to get. It's out of print. If you do a search, you might find a PDF on the internet. But essentially, it talks about how you do product market fit, how you do testing. And effectively, about 10 years later, Eric Ries came along and actually restated a lot of that stuff again and called it Lean Startup. But it's all about that early stage, trying to find product market fit, customer demand type stuff. The guy in the bottom corner is a guy called Brad Feld, a good friend of mine. Interestingly, he didn't just take the thesis to startups. He talked about how you build ecosystems. So we kind of have this lots and lots of content and lots of information about how you start a business. But nobody's ever talked about, actually, now you've started it and it's actually working, what do you do next? Which is a thing that actually a lot of more people are starting to think about. But interestingly, it's only starting to happen now. Reid Hoffman is amazing. For those that don't know him, they should. He founded LinkedIn, and having started a business which was hugely successful, he then started effectively a VC called Greylock. And being able to do both sides of the equation is really interesting. His view is it's not about first mover advantage. It's about first person to scale in a market is actually the one that's going to win. So this obsession about I need to be first is actually not correct. I need to be the first one that grows really rapidly in a market after I've got product market fit is actually more important. That's the person who's most likely to win. This is Reid. And if you go to YouTube, on the Greylock page, there is 20 one-hour sessions on this whole topic. So I'm not even going to get close to being able to describe 20 hours worth of work. But essentially, he's called this thing called Blitz scaling. And essentially, what happened up until quite recently was people went to war on supply chains. And the idea was that you built up a supply chain and then you kind of got to the front line and then you threw rocks at each other, so to speak. But what Blitzkrieg was different was essentially it basically said you lift as much as you can and you run towards the front before the other guys can actually build a supply chain and you try and wipe them out. The advantage of that is you can win very, very quickly and in a very big way. However, if it doesn't work, you've got no supply chain and you all die. Yeah? And that sort of sounds like how you build and scale a business, which is it's all about being competitive. It's all about getting into the market. It's about being scrappy. It's not about evolving and building processes and eventually at some point you get all the things you need to go big. Yeah? If you wait for that, you're going to be beaten by the competition. The key ingredients that he basically describes or has been described in the sessions are as follows. One is the stuff that you've learned as a startup doesn't apply in scale up. It's totally different. You can see it below. It talks about the changing evolution of businesses as I think about it in sort of fives. 5 to 25, 25 to 125, and then 125 to 750. And there are massive break points along as a business at those different junctures. Typically, a startup is what they call the household, which is the 5 at the front. It's only at about 25 when you kind of go, I think I've got the recipe, this is working, I need to slam my foot hard on the pedal, that you go from 25 to 125. 125 to 750 is when you go from a local market or local continent into a global market. The other thing to learn is as you shift from 25 to 125, something weird happens. You create 2 teams, not one. Up to 25, you have 1 team, and everybody's running around building stuff and seeing customers and being amazing and trying to book as much revenue. But as you shift from 25 to 125, actually you have these things called HR people and accountants and all sorts of like support structures. So essentially you have the equivalent of there's a team at the front which is all about product and customer and building, and then you have a support structure. And that fundamentally changes the back of the business. And suddenly you have to think about, oh, this is different from what I started with. Getting people to do that is really hard. Which gets on to the next point, which is recruitment is the hardest thing in this whole process. It's like, how do you go from 25 and be 5 times bigger? The next line is equally important, which is when you go through that growth, actually how you maintain the culture when suddenly the 25 people that you had in the business is completely swamped now by 100 more people that you've just hired in the last 12 months. A lot of that is driven essentially by ensuring that underneath all of this, that people feel they have a mission. This is not a job, this is a way of life. This is a thing that people buy into. And it's equally as important to make sure the people you recruit are buying into that process. The other thing which, this is also the other part that founders struggle with is, when they start, they're there, they're hands-on, they're actually physically trying to fix all of the problems in a business. At a certain point, they can't fix them anymore. They have to find the right people, and they have to coach those people into thinking about and solving those problems and delegating that to third parties. Secondary to this is this wonderful lady called Sherry Kutu. This is different. This is actually quite interesting. So Reid is really obsessed about how you help support startups to become grow-ups and finish-ups. Sherry's thinking on a macro level, thinking about top-down. What are the conditions that are necessary to help support startups become grow-ups? There was a piece of research done a few years ago which basically said in the UK economy, 6%, the top 6% of growth businesses actually created half of the jobs. And that's the reason why this stuff's really important. This is why governments across the whole of Europe have woken up to, actually, this is what we need to do to try and create and develop employment. Underneath is a weird graph, but basically what the graph says is Europe's really good at companies that neither grow nor decline. They're just there, yeah? What they're really bad at is stuff which grows really quickly and stuff that declines really quickly compared to the US. What that essentially means is the market in the US is much more fluid. Businesses which are in decline, decline really quickly, and businesses that grow, grow really quickly. It's a much more efficient ecosystem. And the key to it is, can you shift those much more in a straight line and potentially above the line? Her basic statements are not analogous, are very similar to what Reid's saying, but in a different context. So her view is that we should be getting government to publish more data about who are the best companies. Because if we're aware of who they are, then we can support them. If we have no idea who they are, then it becomes a struggle. She talks about creating not a startup visa, but a scale-up visa. The single limiting factor in Europe today is experienced entrepreneurs who know how to grow businesses. And actually, when she talks about a startup visa, she means being able to give and deploy a visa in 2 weeks if you find the right candidate anywhere in the world. That's how quickly that startups have to develop and build. The next line is essentially what Reid's talking about, is how do you build leadership? How do you get them to think in a different way? How do you help support those businesses which have hit product market fit? And how do you get them more sales, both locally, and that can be in partnership with a corporate, or internationally? The people we should be sending on trade delegations are not the old incumbents, it should be the new startups. Europe's really strange. We've kind of fixed a lot of problems around finance, but there's this kind of, they call it a barbell effect happening now in Europe, which is there's a lot of Series A funding, which helps to help the scale from 25 upwards. And there's a lot of money coming from the top end down from private equity, and there's a lot of money at later stage. But there's this weird gap being created in the market at the minute from a B and a C position. And unless you're going to the US, where it's much more mature, if you're building your business in Europe and you want to raise a B round, it's actually bloody hard work. Access to infrastructure is just making the whole thing tick, making sure that the local services are actually set up to help support that. And that's me. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of minutes. I want to ask you a couple of personal questions.
Go for it.
If you were in the situation where your company's reached 100 people, you need to raise another round, what kind of investor should you look at when you're in Europe? Can you find it in Europe? Should you go to the US?
So the challenge you have is and this is happening, so the people who believe that Europe is a single market, it's not. it's about 26 different markets with 26 different laws and 26 different tax authorities. It's a nightmare. And so what I tend to see in a lot of my startups is they try to build a business in their local market, UK, France, Germany. And the next thing they do is they'll go and expand into the US market because it's a much easier and a bigger market and singular market. And because you're addressing a US market, you're more likely to attract US investors at that point. The challenge you have is if you go from I'm in the UK and I now want to be in France and Germany and Holland, actually finding those European investors that fit in that B is really hard. I think there's a hope that there's more stuff EIF are trying to do to encourage more capital in from corporates and other non-traditional sources to fix that problem.
And where should you look for an investor that understands the culture of a high-growth company? Because a lot of the later stage investors that you end up talking to evaluate companies based on profit. Or
yeah, what's interesting is if you look at the cycle from startup to finish up, as you get further through the process, money just becomes money. Actually, it doesn't really matter. Well, like Goldman Sachs will write you a check for $25 million. It's like hell. If it's at the right terms, it's fine. The thing which is actually much more important, and I think it's what you're touching on, is actually at an early stage, getting people who actually understand the dynamics of what it feels like to do a startup is actually more important earlier than at a later point. I think you then end up having to have corporate finance and lawyers and accountants who can help support and manage that process.
And countries like Spain or the UK have made efforts to build alternative routes for that kind of growth, for example, with alternative stock markets.
Yeah.
What do you think of those? In Spain, we don't have a very good experience because some of the earlier examples were big failures or deceptions. So.
I think the advantage is that's a country problem, not a startup problem. Mm-hmm. So I think there's enough countries around the world, and the US is particularly one, which is actually quite well equipped to deal with IPOs. And so if local governments don't get their shit together, pardon my French, actually those companies will go elsewhere. And so I think you'll find that it's not the startups that are complaining, it's actually the local countries and governments are complaining. And actually to some degree the investors are complaining because they can't get their money out fast enough because they need to think of an exit route into a different market.
So just to close, if you would give the French government a piece of advice to build your first set of billion-dollar companies, what would it be?
What would it be? Get the hell out of the way.
Well, thank you, Jon. You're going to have to run back.
Thank you.
Not to get hit.